Years ago in a married student ward, there was a new convert that happened to be, I think, secretary in the Relief Society presidency. There was a month where ward council came up, and it just so happened that the president of the Relief Society and her first counselor and her second counselor were all out of town. So the buck stopped with that new convert secretary, who found herself in her very first ward council meeting. Well, in ward council, you see the backside of the tapestry. You see the seams that are covered up in front. It's a raw and real view of the inner workings of a congregation. And wherever there are humans and human interactions, things can get messy. Well, it was her first chance to see the messiness of the church. And after ward council, she went up to her bishop, wide-eyed and jaw dropped, and just said, "Our ward's a mess." And the bishop just kind of smiled and said, "Yes, they all are, because we all are." How do we deal with this, though? That's the question. What do we do when things go wrong? How do we help them go right again? And in some ways, based on what we're going to see in section 85, there are two main approaches. There's a celestial approach, and then there's a more worldly approach. There's God's way, and then there's my way. And there's a lot of different ways you can subdivide those two in terms of heavenly or earthly motivation, or approach, or accountability, or whatever it might be. But what we're going to see in two verses in section 85 is, are we going to try to clean things up and fix things the Lord's way, according to His will? Or do I want to do things my way? I have a certain vision of how things are supposed to look and how they're supposed to run. And so I'm going to try to wrest the steering wheel away from God and His servants in the direction I want to steer this thing. Ooh, careful about that. Well, here's the first verse with the first approach, and then I'll show you the second verse with the second approach. Verse 7 of section 85 says, "It shall come to pass that I, the Lord God, will send one mighty and strong, holding the scepter of power in his hand, clothed with light for a covering, whose mouth shall utter words, eternal words, while his bowels shall be a fountain of truth, to set in order the house of God, and to arrange by lot the inheritances of the saints, whose names are found, and the names of their fathers and of their children, enrolled in the book of the law of God." So those are people who do want to do things. They want to have their name on the records. They want to be part of that celestial group, that shared identity. But we're not quite doing it right yet. And so we're going to need someone to set in order the house of God. Who's going to clean up this mess at ward council? But also specifically to arrange by lot the inheritance of the saints. I mean, it's one thing to take all of this metaphorically, and I guess we have the historical distance to do that. It affords us that luxury. But for W.W. Phelps on the ground in Missouri, to have Bishop Partridge right there trying to figure out, okay, we just had a new wagon train come in, and they're wanting to stake a claim in Western Missouri and be part of Zion, but they're not consecrating. They want to receive. They're not willing to give. What do I do here? In some ways, Bishop Partridge was having a hard time, and he was making mistakes. We're all human, including bishops and so on, right? All the way up and down, okay, we're human. But what do we do in the meantime as we wait for someone mighty enough and strong enough to clean up the mess and to clarify this is how things need to work. This is how it's going to go. Now, in the literal moment, in the historical context, sending one mighty and strong may have come across to Bishop Partridge, for example, of, oh, am I going to get released from my calling? Is some new bishop going to be called that's mighty enough and strong enough to solve the issues here? Well, maybe I need to do a little bit more to magnify my calling and seek the Lord's inspiration and really try to solve the local problems here on the local level. Then again, I think that is part of it, okay? That is a legitimate understanding of what we see in verse 7. But notice again the language that is used, and that seems to far surpass any mortal bishop, no matter how amazing they are. Remember the phrases? Mighty, strong, scepter of power, clothed with light as a covering, speaking eternal words, his bowels a fountain of truth. Wow. I love my bishop. I've loved all the bishops I've served with and served under and just been led by, but I don't think any of them would feel comfortable with that kind of description. Like, nope, that wasn't me. Then who was it? Who is it? Hopefully the language makes things clear. The only one mighty enough and strong enough to truly set in order the house of God is the Son of God himself. Who is the one that will arrange the inheritances of the saints? Well, the same one that spoke of many mansions in his Father's house. How is the church finally going to be ready and worthy for its paradisiacal glory? Well, Christ himself will come to reign, and we'll let him rule and reign over us. We'll be willing to do things his way. That's the beauty, that's the promise of verse 7. But what's the alternative? Well, verse 8. Side by side, I love the juxtaposition here. To choose, will I be a verse 7 saint or a verse 8 example? Look at what he says in verse 8. While that man who was called of God and appointed, that putteth forth his hand to steady the ark of God, shall fall by the shaft of death, like as a tree that is smitten by the vivid shaft of lightning. Whew, that's strong language. Now, was that aimed at Bishop Partridge? If so, I bet he's squirming under that kind of rhetorical pressure. Hit by a shaft of lightning? Smitten like a tree? Fall by the shaft of death? Seriously? Now again, this is stronger than to be taken literally. But to think about the scriptural allusion that is being used here, it really does suggest that Joseph has been buried in his work in the JST, because he's pulling out some obscure passages in the Old Testament. We just saw him bring up Ezra chapter 2. Well, here he's bringing up 2 Samuel chapter 6. In 2 Samuel 6, you read the brief story of Uzzah, who was walking alongside the Ark of the Covenant when Israel was on the move. Remember, the tabernacle is a portable temple, so you fold it up, disassemble it, and then carry it to the next spot where you can set up the tabernacle again. Put the furnishings back inside, the table of showbread, the altar of incense, the Ark of the Covenant, chief of all, in the Holy of Holies. Well, the Ark of the Covenant is on a cart, being pulled by oxen. It's a lot lighter that way. But as the oxen are going over some unlevel ground, some uneven ground, the cart starts to rock. And the last thing on earth you want to have happen is the Ark of the Covenant to fall off and break on the side of the road. So Uzzah, what does he do? He puts his hand out and steadies the ark. He keeps it from falling. And he is immediately hit by the shaft of death and dies. Now, that story leaves us scratching our heads like, what did he do wrong? He was just trying to help. Or was he? For this, you really need to understand how the Ark of the Covenant and how the tabernacle itself was meant to be transported. It wasn't by ox cart. It was on the shoulders of Levites who were called to bear up the burdens of their priesthood service. At some point, Uzzah, what are you doing? You don't want the ark to fall? Great, but you're not willing to bear it up the way that Lord intended? So your efforts, I'm just trying to help. I don't know about that. You were supposed to be carrying the covenant in the Lord's way, not trying to find some easier way out from underneath those burdens. And then when things start to go wrong because you weren't doing things right, it's a little late to try to stick the hand out and keep things propped up in the wrong way. You understand? If the story of Uzzah makes sense to us, then perhaps section 85 will make a little more sense too. What are you doing there in Missouri? How are you trying to set up Zion? Are you doing it in a Zion way? Or are you looking for easier outs to distribute inheritances? For me, the lesson of this part of section 85 is, do you want to be a verse 7 or a verse 8 kind of saint? Leader or follower, whatever it might be. Am I the type that wants to set in order, or am I the type that wants to steady the ark? Will I bear it up and bear my burdens well? Or do I want to kind of sidestep that stewardship and just put a hand on it now and then? You understand? There's a fascinating story in 1 Nephi where Laman and Lemuel are watching Nephi build the ship and murmuring the whole time. We come from Jerusalem, little brother. It's landlocked. You ever seen a boat? You really think this one's going to float across the sea? The irony, though, is Laman and Lemuel only complained when they weren't building. Once they joined Nephi in the construction project, no more complaints from them. And I have found often when we are complaining about the way the church is running, we might not be as engaged in its construction as we were called to be. Yes, we have a lot of room to grow and a lot of work to do before Zion will be established upon the earth. What's our approach in getting there? And rather than steadying the ark from some side position, oh, get under it, bear up our burdens, lift where we stand, not refusing to lift and not deciding to stand somewhere else in someone else's position. In some ways, that's what we need to be doing as we prepare the earth for the coming of Christ, when the mightiest and strongest of them all will come and truly set everything in order.